Following the end of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union had very different ambitions for the future of the world. The two had been uneasy allies at best. The United States knew that Stalin was a dictator who had once been Hitler's ally and only supported the Allies after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. The Soviets resented the Allies' delay in invading Europe, and relations worsened when the Soviets learned that the United States had developed its atomic bomb in secret. In spite of these problems, hopes for world peace were high at the end of the war. The most visible symbol of this hope was the United Nations. On April 25, 1945, representatives from 50 nations met in San Francisco to establish this new peacekeeping body. The charter to establish the United Nations was signed on July 26, 1945. Ironically, even though the United Nations was intended to promote peace, it soon became the arena in which the United States and the Soviet Union competed. In July 1945, we saw the Potsdam Conference. In this conference, Stalin promised to allow free elections in Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe, including the Soviet zone of occupation in Germany. Germany was divided into 4 zones of occupation, 3 of which were later to be reunified. And finally, the Soviet Union agreed to enter the war against Japan. It soon became apparent that the Soviets would not allow free elections in Eastern Europe. In fact, they banned all democratic political parties in those nations. Stalin installed communist governments in Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Poland. These countries became satellite nations of the Soviet Union. In 1946, Stalin gave a speech announcing that communism and capitalism were incompatible. It appeared that another war was inevitable. Faced with the Soviet threat, the United States proposed a policy of containment in 1946, taking measures to prevent any extension of communism around the world. This policy guided the foreign policy of the Truman administration as well as the administration of every American president through Ronald Reagan. In March of 1946, Winston Churchill gave a speech describing the situation in Europe, saying that communism was an iron curtain that had descended across the continent of Europe. The Iron Curtain came to stand for the division of Europe. Stalin declared that Churchill's words were a call to war. The conflicting U.S. and Soviet aims in Europe led to a conflict known today as the Cold War, a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union in which neither nation directly confronted the other on the battlefield. The Cold War would dominate global affairs and U.S. foreign policy from 1945 until the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. The Truman Doctrine. The U.S. first tried to contain Soviet influence in Greece and Turkey. March 12, 1947, President Truman asked Congress for $400 million in economic and military aid for Greece and Turkey. Truman declared that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. In June of 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall proposed that the U.S. provide aid to all European nations that needed it. And over the next 4 years, 16 countries received $13 billion in aid under what was known as the Marshall Plan. As a result of the Marshall Plan, Western Europe flourished by 1952, and communism had lost much of its appeal in Western Europe. The United States and its allies continued to clash with the Soviet Union over the issue of German reunification. In 1948, Britain, France, and the United States combined their 3 occupation zones into one nation, West Germany. This left the western part of Berlin, which had also been controlled by these 3 nations, surrounded by Soviet-controlled East Germany. In response, Stalin moved quickly to close off all access to West Berlin in June 1948. As a result, no food, water, or fuel could reach that part of Berlin. The 2.1 million residents of the city had only enough food to last 5 weeks. In an attempt to break the blockade, American and British officials started the Berlin Airlift, to fly food and supplies into West Berlin. For 327 days, 277,000 flights brought in 2.3 million tons of supplies, and West Berlin survived only because of this airlift. By May 1949, the Soviet Union realized that it had been beaten and lifted the blockade. That same month, the western part of Germany officially became the Federal Republic of Germany, and the Soviets, in response, created the German Democratic Republic, better known as East Germany. On April 4, 1949, 10 Western European nations joined the United States and Canada in forming a defensive military alliance to counter Soviet aggression. This alliance was called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. For the first time in its history, the United States had entered into a military alliance with other nations during peacetime. The Cold War had ended any U.S. hope of a return to isolationism at the end of World War II. In May of 1949, Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese nationalists fled mainland China to the island of Taiwan, or Formosa, after more than 20 years of struggle. Chinese communists finally controlled all of mainland China, and their leader, Mao Zedong, headed the Chinese communist regime. It appeared that the U.S. policy of containment had failed, but events in China were the result of internal forces. The situation was complicated by the fact that World War II ended with the Soviets controlling the northern portion of Korea, which was divided at the 38th parallel. When the U.S. began reducing the number of troops it held in South Korea, the Soviets determined to support a North Korean bid to take over the entire Korean peninsula. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces swept across the 38th parallel into South Korea, and the conflict that followed became known as the Korean War. When the matter of defending South Korea came to a vote in the United Nations, the Soviets boycotted in protest over the presence of nationalist China, Taiwan. The vote passed because the Soviets could not veto the measure. So in all, some 16 nations sent 520,000 troops to aid South Korea, although over 90% of these troops were American, and this would become a hallmark of any action taken by the United Nations. It was done, the action would be taken in the name of the United Nations, but it was largely American troops or an American bankroll that funded the project. September 15, 1950, General Douglas MacArthur launched a surprise amphibious landing behind North Korean lines at Incheon. About half of North Korea's troops surrendered. The other half fled north of the 38th parallel. The Communist Chinese, however, joined the war, sending 300,000 Chinese troops into North Korea in late November 1950, driving United Nations forces southward. For 2 years, the two sides fought bitterly in the Korean hills, with neither side able to gain an advantage. To halt the bloody stalemate in early 1951, General Douglas MacArthur, commander of the American forces in Korea, called for an extension of the war into China. President Truman rejected MacArthur's request, fearing that a UN attack on China would bring the Soviet Union into the war. UN forces instead counterattacked in Korea, returning to their positions along the 38th parallel. MacArthur continued to agitate for an escalation of the war, forcing Truman to fire MacArthur on April 11, 1951. In his closing remarks to Congress, MacArthur said, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." On June 23, 1951, Soviet Union suggested a ceasefire. Truce talks began in July. The opposing sides reached agreement on 2 points. The first of which was the location of the ceasefire line, which would be the 38th parallel, and the formation of a demilitarized zone to be established at the 38th parallel. Overall, the Korean War cost the United States 54,000 American lives and $67 billion. As a result of this expensive, unsuccessful war, Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower, former overall commander of the Allied effort in Europe during World War II, is elected president in 1952. The United States' fears of communism at home as a result of Soviet and Chinese aggression and the war in Korea sparked a number of witch hunts. In June 1953, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg became the first United States citizens executed for espionage following a sensational trial. Senator Joseph McCarthy led anti-communist hearings, claiming that communists were attempting to take over the U.S. government. These attacks on suspected communists became known as McCarthyism. McCarthy's accusations against the U.S. Army and his bullying of witnesses in 1954 eventually led to his downfall. On November 1st, 1952, the United States exploded the first hydrogen bomb, or H-bomb. The H-bomb had the force of 1 million tons of TNT and was 67 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima in August 1945. The Soviets exploded their own thermonuclear weapon in August 1953, and the arms race between East and West was on. Under Eisenhower and his Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, the United States pledges to use all of its force, including nuclear weapons, against any aggressor nation to stop the spread of communism. This becomes known as the policy of brinkmanship. Both the United States and the Soviet Union began a massive buildup of nuclear weapons. In 1955, when West Germany was allowed to rearm and join NATO, the Soviets formed the Warsaw Pact, a defensive military alliance which linked the Soviet Union to 7 Eastern European nations. In 1953, Joseph Stalin died and is replaced by Nikita Khrushchev. Like Stalin, Khrushchev believed that communism would eventually rule the world. In addition to the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union, we also see the beginning of the space race, a competition for international prestige. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. Americans were shocked by this development and vowed to win the space race. On January 31st, 1958, the first American satellite is launched. Following the rejection of Eisenhower's Open Skies proposal at the Geneva Convention in 1955, the CIA began making high-altitude reconnaissance flights over the Soviet Union. By 1960, many U.S. officials were concerned about this violation of Soviet airspace, including Eisenhower. Dulles authorized one final flight on May 1, 1960, piloted by Major Francis Gary Powers. 4 hours after he entered Soviet airspace, Powers' plane was shot down, he was captured, and sentenced to 10 years in a Soviet prison following a sensational trial. Eisenhower first denied that the U-2 spy flights were spy missions, but finally was forced to admit the truth when Khrushchev produced the evidence recovered from Powers' plane. Eisenhower agreed to stop the flights, but would not apologize. Because of the U-2 incident, the 1960s would open with increased tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. Despite this Cold War tension, the post-war period for the United States was a period of boom and increase. By the summer of 1946, over 10 million men and women had been released from the armed forces and settled down to rebuild their lives. To ease veterans' return to normal life, Congress passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, also known as the GI Bill of Rights, in 1944. This bill encouraged veterans to get an education by paying part of their tuition. It also promised a year's worth of unemployment benefits while they looked for a new job. In addition, it offered low-interest loans, which veterans used to buy homes, farms, or establish businesses. After World War II, the United States converted from a wartime to a peacetime economy. The United States immediately canceled war contracts totaling $35 million. Within 10 days after Japan's surrender, more than 1 million defense workers were laid off. Unemployment increased and prices shot up when the OPA ended its controls on inflation. Within 2 weeks, the price of consumer goods rose more than 25%. While prices spiraled upward, many American workers earned less than they had during the war. To halt this new round of inflation, Congress implemented price controls similar to those in place during wartime. Economists who forecast a post-war depression, however, were wrong. They failed to consider consumers' pent-up desires for an accumulation of wants and needs that had been put on hold when the U.S. industry switched from peacetime to wartime production in the 1940s. With years of savings from defense work, savings and investments in war bonds, Americans had money to spend on new consumer items once we switched from a wartime to a peacetime production. The Cold War also contributed to economic growth. Concern over Soviet expansion kept American defense spending high. Foreign aid, such as the Marshall Plan, helped European nations recover from the war and thus helped the U.S. by creating foreign markets for U.S. goods. Truman was the first president to truly support civil rights. He is well known for his saying, "The buck stops here," in reference to the fact that he was responsible for his administration in the country. Truman put his presidency on the line for civil rights. In 1946, he created a President's Commission on civil rights. He also asked Congress for several measures, including a federal anti-lynching law, a ban on the poll tax, and a permanent civil rights commission. Congress refused to pass these measures or a measure to integrate the armed forces, so Truman himself took action. In 1948, Truman issues an executive order for the integration of the armed forces. He also ordered an end to discrimination in the hiring of government employees. In the election of 1948, Truman became the Democratic nominee, despite the fact that many Americans blamed him for the post-war inflation. A number of Southern Democrats, who became known as Dixiecrats, formed the States' Rights Democratic Party to protest. They did not support Truman's civil rights measures. Dixiecrats nominated South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond as their candidate for president, and Republicans nominated New York Governor Thomas Dewey, who rapidly took a lead in the polls. Truman took his campaign to the people, traveling across the country by train. In the end, Truman won a stunning upset against Dewey in a close political race. Once elected, Truman initiated an extension of Roosevelt's New Deal programs known as the Fair Deal. One program raised the hourly minimum wage from 40 cents an hour to 75 cents an hour. Despite social and economic victories, Truman's approval rating sank to an all-time low by 1951. The stalemate in the Korean War and McCarthyism became overwhelming issues, and Truman decided not to run for re-election. Democrats nominated Adlai Stevenson, who ran against Republican candidate General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower's campaign slogan was, "I like Ike," and his running mate, Richard Milhous Nixon, exhibited a masterful use of the new medium of television. Eisenhower won 55% of the popular vote and a majority of the Electoral College. Businesses boomed in the 1950s. More people began working in white-collar positions than in blue-collar manufacturing jobs. Corporations continued to expand by forming conglomerates, a major corporation that included a number of smaller companies in unrelated industries. Another strategy for business expansion, franchising, developed. A franchise is a company that offers similar products or services in many locations, such as McDonald's, which opened in 1955. Improvements in transportation, particularly a boom in the automobile industry, meant that more and more people no longer had to live in the cities they worked in. New highways and the affordability of cars and gasoline made commuting possible. Suburbs sprang up around every major American city. 13 million new homes were built in the 1950s. 85% of them were built in the suburbs. For many, the suburbs embodied the American dream: an affordable house, good schools, a safe and healthy environment for children, and good neighbors similar to themselves. As soldiers returned from World War II and settled into family life, they contributed to an unprecedented population explosion known as the baby boom. During the late 1940s through the early 1960s, the birth rate in the United States soared. At the height of the baby boom in 1957, one American infant was born every 7 seconds, for a total of 4,308,000 that year alone. The result was the largest generation in American history. By the mid-1950s, 60% of Americans were members of the middle class. They wanted, and had the money to buy, increasing numbers of consumer products. Consumerism, buying material goods, came to be equated with success and thus became an American way of life. Consumers purchased new electrical household items such as washing machines, dryers, blenders, freezers, and dishwashers in record numbers. People also bought recreational items such as televisions, tape recorders, and new hi-fi record players. In addition to creating new products, manufacturers began using a marketing strategy called planned obsolescence. In order to encourage consumers to buy more, manufacturers purposefully planned for items to become obsolete or to wear out or become outdated. And this process is still in use today, and if you don't believe it, all you have to do is look at Apple's iPhone. Compared with other forms of mass media, television developed with lightning speed. First widely available in 1948, TVs had reached 5% of American homes by 1950 and 55% of homes by 1955. By 1960, almost 90% of American homes, 45 million, had televisions. Programming was meager and in black and white. In 1956, the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, was established to regulate and license television, telephone, telegraph, and radio industries. Although TV found a wide audience for its portrayal of mostly popular culture, dissenting voices rang out through the 1950s. The Beat movement expressed the social and literary nonconformity of artists, poets, and writers. Followers of this movement were called beatniks and lived nonconformist lives. They shunned regular work and sought higher consciousness through music, poetry, and sometimes drugs. Musicians in the 1950s added electronic instruments to traditional blues music, creating rhythm and blues. African American artists played this music at first to largely white audiences. The new music became known as rock and roll. It was a type of music that was distinctly American. Artists included Chuck Berry, Bill Haley and the Comets, and Elvis Presley. Despite the portrait painted by popular culture, life in America did not live up to the American dream. In 1962, nearly 1 out of every 4 Americans was living below the poverty level. Many of the poor were elderly or members of minority groups. When millions of middle-class Americans fled the cities for the suburbs in the 1950s, they carried with them economic resources and isolated themselves from other races and classes. This urban crisis became known as white flight. Cities lost not only people, but also businesses and revenue from income taxes paid by the middle classes. This resulted in cities being unable to properly maintain inner-city schools, public transportation, and police and fire departments. The inner-city poor suffered, and the gap between the haves and the have-nots increased.